We are in week 5, and we're in the series called The Return of the Gods. It's based on a book by Jonathan Cahn. How many have bought the book since I started this series? A few of you? One of you? Really? You guys are like, yeah, Barry will tell us what's in it. We don't need to buy it. We can save the money. Anyway. So the book is by Jonathan Cahn. His contention in the book is, and I say this every week, but is that America and the Western civilization has forgotten the God of the Bible, Yahweh, over the last half century, and has created a doorway for the return of the ancient pagan gods that we read about in the Old Testament. These gods are not really gods at all. They are called in the book the Shadim, or that's in the Old Testament, that's what they're called, which means spirits of destruction. Paul calls them demons. From that word, the Shadim, we get demonia in Greek, which means the demons or the demonic realm in the New Testament. And as we learn, there are 3 main Shadim that Israel kept turning to in the Old Testament when they would fall away from the Lord. Jonathan calls them the Dark Trinity. They are the possessor, who is Baal. We looked at him in week 1. The enchantress, we looked at her last week, Ashtoreth or Ishtar. And finally, this week, we're going to look at the destroyer, who in the Bible is named Molech. Jonathan writes in his book that today most people are not going to overtly worship these gods by their old names. Some do, but that's a fringe element. Or they may not even see them as gods at all, but that the evil actions that these demons led Israel into are the same evil actions that we see coming back into our Western world today. And so he's saying the evidence of their influence in our culture is everywhere. This morning we will look at the last member of the Dark Trinity, Molech, or the destroyer, as Jonathan calls him in his book. Now, although Molech is not the head god of the Dark Trinity, that probably would be Baal or Baal, nor is he the most influential. That would probably be Ashtoreth, or that we looked at last week. But Molech is probably the darkest. Molech is called in Scripture the abomination. Let's look at 1 Kings 11, 4-8 in the English Standard Version. That's the one I'm using today, because I don't want any of you to be able to look in your NIVs and follow along. That's not why. I like the English Standard Version's way of putting it, so that's what I'm using in this sermon, in some of this text. But in 1 Kings 11, 4-8, follow along with me if you can. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, or Molech, that's another name for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. Molech was the god of human sacrifice, and most often child sacrifice. He was the principality of bloodlust, of death and destruction. It is heartbreaking to me to read this account where near the end of Solomon's life, he would actually build an altar to Molech in the high places in the mountains next to Jerusalem. Think about that, church. Imagine for a moment altars being built in Israel near the whole holy city, near where Solomon had built the temple to Yahweh. And now the worship that was done at these altars included the sacrifice of children. When you build an altar to Molech, you do the types of sacrifices that Molech requires. The passing of the children of Israel into the fires of Molech. Remember also that the worship of Ashtoreth, which we looked at last week, leads, or there is a progression to the worship of Molech. It says that Solomon went after Ashtoreth first, the goddess of sexual promiscuity, because he had married foreign women who were not believers in Yahweh, and had, for whatever reason, these women, his wives, had not abandoned their gods and embraced his. They were able, it says, to turn his heart away from Yahweh to other gods, to their gods. And one of the reasons for this is because Solomon actually broke God's law about what kings are supposed to do. Now this part is not in the book. I came up with this part all my own. Maybe he'll add it to his book later. Deuteronomy 17, let's read it together, 14 to 19. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, who the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. The next slide. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law that Moses is giving at that moment, approved by the Levitical priest, and it shall be with him, this is the king, and he shall read it all the days of his life. Did you know this was something the king was supposed to do? He shall read this law all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of his law, of this law and these statutes, and doing them. You think Solomon kept that law? God allowed Solomon to have many wives, but God never approved of Solomon or King David, for that matter, of having many wives. They were supposed to have a book of the law written, and that book was these passages that Moses is reading right here, and that book was to be in their possession, and they were to read it every day. This is one of the first places where someone is told to read their Bible every day. Why? To keep them from sin that could lead them into all kinds of abominations. And we know that Solomon didn't keep the law. In 1 Kings 11:1-3, this is the first part of that 1 Kings passage. King Solomon, it says, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had, I want you to read that. He had 700 wives. And that's not all his wives. He had 700 wives of royal birth, it says, and 300 concubines. And it says that his wives led him astray. Whenever I do anything wrong, that's what I think happened to me. My wife has led me astray. No. Now, obviously, Solomon did not keep this law. He didn't keep the one about the gold or the horses either, if you read about how splendid Solomon's kingdom was. And it says that his wives led him astray. On a side note, there's a reason that God says we should not be unequally yoked in marriage with an unbeliever. I have done a few marriages where one person was a believer and the other was not, and I would counsel the believer, you sure you really want to do this? And they would always be, oh yeah, I love this person. But the hope was that they would somehow convert their loved one. But instead, sometimes it happens, but often what happens is the believing spouse ends up having to compromise. They have to be careful about being too religious around their unbelieving spouse. They'll often disagree about how to raise the children. Often the believing spouse stops going to church to appease their spouse, to spend time with them because the weekend is the only time we have together, blah, blah, blah. And I know that marrying a believer is not a guarantee of a happy marriage. You always have to work hard at your marriage, and people always have to work at their marriage for it to be great. But marrying an unbeliever is to set it up to fail. And I have found that often you get led astray. I think the heart of Solomon's sin here is sexual. The guy has a harem of wives and concubines. And it says that he held fast to them in love. That's not a good kind of love. It says that he built altars to the foreign gods, which meant he built an altar to Ashtoreth, which was the goddess of sexual promiscuity. So that means sexual promiscuity was probably happening at that altar. He built an altar to Molech, the destroyer, which means that there was child sacrifices happening at that altar. It seems to me that sexual sin often leads, like Ashtoreth leads to Molech. One thought I had was King David, after he had an affair or had actually just taken Bathsheba. She had no power. And it says after he impregnates her, eventually to cover up his sin, what does he do? He kills Uriah, her husband, the Hittite. And I've read that story. So many movies have David and Bathsheba in this love story. They love one another. I want you to think about if you were Bathsheba for a moment. A king takes you and basically has his way with you without your consent, and then kills your husband and takes you as his wife. Would you love him? Just a thought, anyway. Ashtoreth leads to Molech. Solomon's sexual problems led him to compromise with his foreign wives into then building altars to their gods instead of them ultimately believing in his. Let's read Leviticus 18:21-26. He says this, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not lie with an animal and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these," and this is the part I want you to hear, "the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. The land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations." Molech is connected to all of these sexual abominations as well. Today, it's hard to think of a world where human sacrifice was common practice. But again, we need to remember that the reason these ideas shock us is because of the God of the Bible and the Christianization of the Western world. Before Christianity came, in the pagan world, human sacrifice was the rule, not the exception. It was found in the temples of Egypt. It was found in the shrines of Tahiti, from the altars of Mesopotamia to the hanging trees of Germany, from India to Hawaii, from West Africa to Tibet, from the Aztecs to the Celts. I remember going down to Mexico. Now all they ever want you to do is to go to their show where they pretend to kill a maiden. From the Druids to the Mongolians and countless other peoples and lands, human and child sacrifice were symptomatic of the pagan cultural values, the devaluation and degradation of human life. Pagan culture was exceedingly dangerous for children. Beyond sacrifice, children were in danger of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, mistreatment, and murder. If a child was born with a birth defect, a deformity, handicapped, or even just the wrong sex, it was not uncommon to leave them in a garbage dump, or drown them in the river, or expose them to the elements, or leave them for the wild animals. It was not uncommon for a child to be killed in the mother's womb as well. There's documented evidence that this was a common practice, that the Christians were trying to get them to stop. The early Christians. So it is not surprising that when a culture abandons the God of the Bible, one of the first things that goes is the value of human life, especially children. We see the value of human life begins to be measured by its perceived contribution to society. How much value does a person add to the whole? And by the way, I feel, you might disagree with me, but that one of the problems is Marxism kind of breeds that same idea. The whole is more important than the individual. The children and the disabled and the elderly are seen as a drain on society. You see, the biblical value of human life is connected to the idea that we are created in God's image, and because of that, human life is sacred. And that belief has been replaced in our culture today with the idea that we are just another animal. We are just part of the evolutionary process, and ironically now, other animals are often seen as more sacred than we are. If a human baby has the same value as a fish while we kill and eat fish. So what's wrong with taking a human life in the womb? In the pagan and secular world, human life is not privileged. In a recent documentary I was watching about a man-eating tiger in India, I found it fascinating that in the midst of this show, the biggest debate they were having was whether it was fair to capture the tiger and put him in a zoo. Not even kill him. Don't go shoot the tiger. He'd killed something like 5 people at this point. So we don't want to kill him. Why? Because actually he's just doing what tigers do, and he should be left in the wild. Why? Because it's his forest as well, and these people keep walking in his forest, and that's why they all got killed. Plus, he's worshipped kind of as a god almost, and by some of the tribes in that part of India. And so the people were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we should keep a man-eating tiger out in the woods. It's wrong for us to shoot him. We're seeing more of these. It's not just wrong to shoot him, but it's wrong to put him in a zoo even, which is what they did eventually. We're seeing more of these same sentiments in North America. I don't know about you guys, but black bears seem to be allowed to roam our streets and eat out of our dumpsters at night, but we never capture them, we never move them, we just leave them, and God forbid if anyone was to ever kill one of them. Instead, we're told to leave them alone. Don't bother them and they won't bother you. That's what we're told. We didn't used to think that way. We used to move them. And the reason often given is they have the same right to be here as you do, maybe more. They were here first, Barry. They're allowed to come into your backyard and eat your apples and whatever. The biblical idea that we are called to fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it, that we find in Genesis, has been replaced really with an idea that we are to blend in. The biblical view of human life is much different than this. Every human life, whether it's male or female, young or old, healthy or infirm, strong or weak, rich or poor, is of an infinite value. And any idea of sacrificing a child at the altar of a foreign god, biblically, is abhorrent. It is strictly forbidden. Psalm 127:3 says that children are a gift. They're a heritage from the Lord. God gives us our kids, and life is treated as sacred right from the point of conception. Psalm 139:13-16. You can read it with me. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came into being. 2 great experiments, or social experiments, happened in the last 100 years that were highly influenced by Darwinism and evolution and by secular philosophy, people like Friedrich Nietzsche. And they show what happens when a nation abandons the God of the Bible. One of those was communism, and it produced the Soviet Union and China. Not surprisingly, abortion was first made legal in the Soviet Union in 1920. The other was Nazi Germany. In both cases came the devaluation of human life and the subsequent murder of literally millions of people. In the Soviet Union and China came the legalization of abortion. It's interesting to me that, remember China just recently, right, had said they were only going to allow one child to be born. They've abandoned this policy, but they made the policy that only one child should be born, and they aborted. They had forced abortion for every other child. You had to get permission. You had to get a card allowing you to have a child. And so what happened was all of the people were keeping the male children, but none of the female children. And then suddenly China had a crisis where they didn't have enough females for their male population. And that happened over a number of years. In Germany's case, though, it was the experimentation on the undesirable children of other nations, especially if you think about it, the children of Israel. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, which included aborting fetuses, it included eugenics, experiments on handicapped children, horror after horror done in the name of creating the master race. In the Old Testament, the ultimate goal of the demons behind Molech was to get Israel herself, God's chosen people, to lay their babies in the molten hands of Molech so that they would roll down into the fire. And in essence, Germany was taking those same babies. One of the ways that the worship of Ashtoreth and the temple prostitution led to the worship of Molech was the unwanted pregnancies that would happen. It is believed that often the unwanted children that were produced through the temple prostitution were used in sacrificing to Molech, or often it would be smaller children, weaker children, or female children. It's interesting that for many years, like I said, this policy with China. It was the babies born with birth defects that were sacrificed, the defective, the unwanted ones, the weak ones. It was the poor ones. Often with Molech, if a wealthy person did not want to sacrifice their child or didn't have a child, they could go and buy a child from a poor person and take that child to the priest, and then the priest would sacrifice the child. So again, it was often the marginalized parts of society that bore the brunt of Molech. So, do we see Molech in our world today? I think most of us can see the connection. Abortion didn't start in the 60s. It was around before then, but it was on the margins. It was mostly illegal. Or if it was legal, it was done only when the mother's life was in jeopardy. But during the 60s and 70s, and Roe versus Wade happened in 1973, basically around the same time as the sexual revolution came the demand from many women that what they called their reproductive rights, the right to their own body and what happens to their own body through pregnancy. And I know this is a complicated issue, and women have not been treated well throughout history. But I've thought about this just from, and I want to say this sensitively. In essence, what they want is the right to not be pregnant if they get pregnant. I want you all to think about this. Rape and incest notwithstanding. So let's take that out of the equation. In one sense, throughout most of the Christian time of our culture, women have always had the right, in one sense, to not get pregnant. The way they would do that is through abstinence. They have always had the right to their own body in our Christian culture. As far as the laws of the land go, sexual relations have to be consensual and age appropriate. They had the right to control their own body, with one exception: when they were bearing a child after they had gotten pregnant. Why? Because as a society, we saw the child as an innocent human life, totally dependent on the love of the mother. And we valued motherhood as a gift from God. But what people are protesting for today and what they want and have is the right to not protect the child or love the child, but to kill the child. And even if all my sexual activity was my own choice, they want to have sexual freedom, but they don't want the responsibility that's inherent in the act. And I would say that about both men and women. Oftentimes women are left in this place where they're afraid of being single moms and the men don't step up. But I'm trying to show you something here. They want the freedom, the sexual freedom. We want the sexual revolution, but we don't want what it produces. They are, in essence, protesting biology, protesting how babies are made, and the victim of that protest is the child itself. The result is that since the legalization of abortion in the 70s, over 60 million babies have been aborted or killed in America alone. And many hundreds of millions more in the Western world, because countries like Canada and America, we don't just demand the right of abortion in our own country, we demand that every country begins to offer abortion, because we see that as fighting for women's rights all around the world. The greatest hero and inspiration of the abortion movement was a woman named Margaret Sanger. She started Planned Parenthood. She was a socialist feminist who started protesting for birth control for women. She wanted to make birth control legal. It wasn't in the 20s when she started her protesting. But what many people don't know about Margaret Sanger, you actually now Planned Parenthood, because she started Planned Parenthood, she started what became Planned Parenthood, and they have the Margaret Sanger Award that they give to those who fight for women's rights, and Hillary Clinton won that award a couple times. Other people have won it. But what people don't really know about her is she was basically a proponent of eugenics. You guys know what eugenics is? She believed in sterilizing undesirable people so that they could not reproduce. She was racist and believed in purifying humanity through controlled breeding. In fact, her reason for fighting for the legalizing of birth control at the time was not so much about sexual freedom as it was for her about controlling the quality of the genetics of people being born. And I'm going to show you some of her famous quotes. Here's the first one. Birth control itself, often denounced as a violation of natural law, is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit, of preventing the birth of defectives or of those who will become defective. That's from her book, Woman and the New Race. Another quote from Margaret Sanger, the third group of society are those irresponsible and reckless ones who have little regard for the consequences of their acts, or those religious scruples, or whose religious scruples prevent their exercising control over their numbers, meaning population. Many of this group are diseased, feeble-minded, and are of the pauper element, dependent upon the normal and fit members of society for their support. There is no doubt in the minds of all thinking people that the procreation of this group should be stopped. Here's another one. How are we to breed a race of human thoroughbreds unless we follow the same plan, meaning controlled breeding? We must make this country into a garden of children instead of a disorderly back lot overrun with human weeds. The last one from Margaret Sanger is this one. The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. Some of her thoughts came from the fact that she came from a large, poor family. Her mother died of tuberculosis, but she'd had something like 10 or 11 kids, and so Margaret's idea was that all this childbearing had killed her mother and was unfair to women, and so a lot of her thoughts came out of that, and she believed in a lot of what Hitler believed he got from Margaret Sanger. I don't know if people know that. And his view of the master race and how to breed the master race. I read this recently. In 2017, Iceland celebrated. They had first this big splashing celebration from a medical journal that reported they had declared that they had all but eradicated Down syndrome in their country. And people wanted to know, how did you do that? There wasn't any kids being born with Down syndrome until they realized that the reason was that all the Down syndrome babies were being aborted through a free early screening process that virtually 100% of the women in Iceland were using. So it was, it's not that they had cured Down syndrome, they hadn't cured anything. All it was that they were offering this free screening, and the women who took it, any woman who found out that her child had Down syndrome, chose to abort the child. Therefore, year after year after year in Iceland, virtually no children with Down syndrome were born. Some people think this is a beautiful thing, but of course, advocacy groups for the disabled started to go crazy. Think about this. And it shows us clearly one of the ethical problems of abortion, even beyond the killing of a baby. It is about how we choose which baby lives and which baby dies. And it demonstrates, I think, something that's seeped into our culture, and it is our belief, our devaluation of human life, and how we now view who deserves to live and who doesn't deserve to live. And I have not even mentioned yet, and I won't, the whole drive now for MAID and euthanasia and the right to die. And the fact that although some people with terminal illness, they say we're stopping the suffering, and I can understand some of that, but now it's turning into like people that are depressed, they can choose it. But not only that there's a pressure coming. It's a subtle pressure on the elderly or the sick. If you have cancer, but you might have a few years to live, well, you might as well just end it now, because you're a drain on your family. And the pressure is there. It's all part of this devaluing of human life. We are not, in the minds of the world around us, special in any way. And yet God's Word says no. A human being bears the image of the invisible God. You bear the image of God. And not only that, but you are sacred. Human life is sacred. And God says to kill a human being is wrong. It's sin. I'll end this message now with a final quote from Margaret Sanger, which shows, I think, the spirit in which she operated out of. And it says this: birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian churches. I look forward to seeing humanity free someday of the tyranny of Christianity, no less than capitalism. On that happy note, let's invite the worship team to come up.